What's the quickest way you've seen a friend screw up their life? Story 1. He used to be really cool in middle school, to the point where I envied him. He wasn't a popular kid, but he got along with most everybody, got straight A's, and had an awesome family that traveled extensively. There wasn't a single negative aspect to this guy's life. Things changed when we got into 8th grade, however. He started displaying toxic attention-seeking behavior by getting in trouble constantly. There was a point where he got suspended twice in 1 week because he was so disruptive. This was totally out of his character, and I realized it. But he was my best friend, and I chalked it up to him being just a goof. Middle school ended and we got into high school, which is where his behavior really started to decline. Instead of hanging out with me or his friend circle that he had built up for years, he wanted to hang out with all the scummy potheads and druggies. His father was a medical marijuana caregiver, Michigan, so all the broke potheads' eyes lit up at the notion of free and plentiful weed, leading to many fake friends. His attendance at school went from spotty to showing up once a week to not showing up for 4 months. All he did was skip school with his friends and do whatever pharmaceuticals they could get their hands on. He avoided me, alienated me, and straight up started acting like we hadn't been best friends for 4 years prior. I still tried to keep the friendship and got hurt multiple times in the process. Eventually, he moved away with his family to the middle of nowhere about an hour from me, and he doesn't do anything. He will literally sit in his room all day every day, snorting absurd amounts of Adderall, and never gets off his phone the few times went to visit him at his new house. It was like talking to a brick wall. He had changed from a nice young man into a distant, apathetic jerkwad, and I couldn't take it. The last time I saw him was about 2 years ago, and I have no plans of seeing him in the future. It's just not worth the effort. It's really hard to read that story as a start to this video. It's such a downward spiral. It would be very easy to blame this change on substances alone. I don't think that's the case, not completely. It's true that might be a big part of it, but I think it's just growing up as well. It's unfortunate, but people change when they enter puberty. Plus, there could also be other things in the past that we don't know and unearth about this guy. It's just sad to see it change this much. Story 2. Okay, this is a story. I knew an exceptional mind in middle and high school. A smart dude and a good guy. Had an ego, but I would too if I was him with his grades and accomplishments. But he was pirating a ton of music and movies while in college. Don't get me wrong, I was into torrents too, but not into terabytes of stuff. And this 10 years ago. He got sued by the MPAA, drops out of college and starts working at a pizza joint telling his parents he's going to the local college chapter when he wasn't. I guess the depression and the settlement and the amount of money the MPAA took him for was getting to him. So he decides to drive to West Virginia and try to live in the woods. Get most of the way there and decides it's a bad idea. Now he has to explain why he was not at work or home. So he figured out a plan to fake a carjacking, parks his car at the Walmart and throws himself in the trunk for 16 hours and bangs on the trunk until some ladies let him out. The problem is that Walmart has cameras in their parking lot, so he was found to be a liar and does time for faking the crime. Last I heard, he was out working at Denny's. Indian coworker with 3 degrees was pushed into a marriage and decided it was better to quit his job and become a bartender, ultimately becoming an alcoholic, all to make himself so undesirable the family no longer wanted him with their daughter. After the marriage was called off, he put his life back on track like nothing happened, and that was that. Alright, second story in the list is a twofer. I remember when file sharing first became popular and all the lawsuits started flying. You heard of some people that got hit for a lot of money by the MPAA and the RIAA, but everyone thinks it's not going to happen to them, and for many people it isn't. It's just really hard to see this person hit that hard by it. And what did he mean by terabytes? Exactly how much stuff and what kind of stuff was this guy downloading? And also the other guy that got out of the marriage and put his life back together. That's the first one I've heard where the person bounced back from spiraling. Hopefully we get a few more like that. Story 3. Okay, I've been waiting for this. I have a friend who invested way too much into a zombie apocalypse coming. He read too many conspiracies and things just got way out of hand. I remember sitting down with him at one point and listening to him say, "Man, if the zombies don't come soon, I've messed up my life." He bought so many emergency supplies, rations, and pieces of camping equipment, and he'd spend so much time planning what would happen. Like, he bought a katana, become quite invested in the learning of it, trained in ninjutsu, planned out where he'd bug out to, how he'd rescue his friends. But in doing that, he'd spend so much time planning what to do that he'd completely neglected his non-apocalypse life, where everyone else pumped their savings into housing and savings. He invested thousands and thousands of dollars in rations, guns, and katanas. Where everyone else worked on their skills, I guess he did too, but he's put all his points into skills that are exclusively useful in an apocalypse. If there is an apocalypse, he's the most useful person on the planet to know. But if not, there was a twist to that one. This would almost have been a kind of normal story for a person to spiral into. You had me at apocalypse, you lost me at zombie. You can almost understand someone wanting to prepare for an apocalypse. But a zombie apocalypse? What kind of zombies? Where does he think these zombies are going to come from? Story 4. A coworker's wife messed up her life by marrying him. He was close to 30 and she was 17 when they met at a Renaissance fair. Wound up getting married a couple months later. They had to involve her parents since she was underage. The night of their wedding, he encouraged her to get it on with his best friend's wife in the car while they drove around. The week after she turned 18, he took her to a strip club, and either that week or the following, he got her to dance in an amateur night competition, which she won. Within a week or so of that, she was a full-time stripper. She had multiple girlfriends that she would hang out with. Her husband was fine with this because, as he put it, I provide a different service. She wound up getting addicted to pharmaceuticals and then selling pharmaceuticals. They got a divorce. All the above occurred within a 6-month time frame. The girl was several states away from where she had grown up, isolated from any positive influence, and completely dependent on her job as a stripper and her pharmaceutical dealing coworkers. Story 5. Fiance's friend was diagnosed with bipolar, didn't take his meds, slept with a woman twice his age who was married but separated, got her pregnant. She ran back to her husband. Friend didn't see her after that. He attempts suicide and is given meds at the mental hospital, but stops taking them after release. Next thing we know, the guy is living with a girl he met a week earlier, marries her a week after that. She's pregnant almost immediately. He moves them to a new city overnight and then back to their hometown when they can't find work on the fly. She gives birth. He works at Walgreens less than 6 months later. She leaves him with the kid. We don't talk to him anymore, but I think he's on his own, still working at Walgreens. Before all this started, he had a full ride to college to study Russian. He turned it down. It's a sad, strange story. Story 6. Gambling addiction, fruit machines, slot machines. Blew all his salary, hawked himself, maxed out the cards, the usual. With a colleague, took a client out for lunch and abandoned both to play the machine he'd spotted in the bar. Our company was offered a free exhibition stand at an event in northern England, and he was detailed to go up there and man it. He didn't have the money to get there, let alone pay for a night in a hotel, even though he'd get the money back on expenses, so he didn't go. Fired. And it got worse from there. A relative who's been in addiction rehab, it's not all for substances, people, declared recently that he was glad he only had a C substance habit. He reckoned the gambling addicts were the worst of the lot, with the smallest chance of breaking the circle. Betcha they're not, I replied. He smiled, but wanly. Yes, there are more addictions than pharmaceutical. I wonder if the statistics do prove that gambling addicts have the worst chance of breaking the cycle. I guess that's probably true because they don't think that they're drinking or doing any substances that are illegal, so they're not really addicts, are they? It's probably just mind games. Please like and subscribe if you've made it this far. I hope you'll enjoy the rest of this video and have a wonderful day. Story 7. A friend of mine knew since primary school, UK in the 90s, so about 7 or 8 years old, lost his mother to a sudden and unexpected brain aneurysm when he was 21. She was a single parent with no immediate family, living in a rented house. The only thing he inherited was a second-hand car. Said friend sold said car for a pittance, which he spent on pharmaceuticals and alcohol within a month. He then, faced with homelessness, moved in with my parents. I'd moved out by this point, where he lied about having a job for another month. When he was found out, waking up after noon every day for a week was the giveaway, he was asked to leave. He eventually got his life together some years later, but it was a rocky road, and a scary reminder of how close a naive young adult can be to destitution. Story 8. A buddy of mine lost his job and girlfriend because he was an idiot, but had inherited income property from his family. So he sat in his one-bedroom apartment and drank himself to death in about 4 years. I miss him, but he never figured out how to move forward with his life. He was stuck in that high school mentality of as long as you're cool, then everything should work out, right? Dumbest bastard I've ever met, but the nicest dude ever. That guy could throw a party with 3 people, and it was great, but there was no room for him in society, and he knew it, and couldn't figure out anything else. I'm pretty confident he let himself go on purpose so he could always be remembered as the coolest party guy anywhere. Story 9. There was this guy I knew for the better part of a decade. He was always the life of the party, but also had his stuff together. He had a serious long-term job while most of us were still college kids. He was the first of my peers to buy a house. He was always in a serious long-term relationship. One day, the police show up at his house. They have a search warrant and take all the computers in the house. He rented rooms out to several friends. Turns out he had downloaded a prodigious amount of child porn onto his girlfriend's laptop. I don't know all the details, but I know he didn't go to prison. His girlfriend dumped him, obviously. He was put on probation where he couldn't leave the city, so he had to quit his job. He moved out of his own house and into a halfway house. He stopped paying his mortgage, and the house was foreclosed. Auction was just last week. Yes, you don't know, people. You don't know what's going on behind the closed door of their mind. This sounds like a person who was just cool to everybody, and no one knew this was a dark secret of his. The question is, what happened that made the cops suspect him and break in and serve all these warrants? Was it somebody he knew that was suspicious? Was it a tip-off of a network? Story 10. We had a friend who was deep in that no girl will want me, I'ma be a virgin forever hole. So we started Operation Get Ron Laid. Well, it was a total success at a New Year's Eve party. She was kinda odd and pretty ugly, but hey, he knew he could get girls now. By the end of February, they were married. By the end of April, they had both gained at least 200 pounds, lost their jobs, and last I heard, he works part-time at a gas station, and they've been desperately trying to have a kid. Bonus. Apparently, he's been miserable the whole time and stuck with it because he's convinced she's the only one that will want him. Story 11. My friend was complaining how he didn't like his job and he needed to get out of there. I talked to my boss and was able to swing a job interview his way. I basically told him to just show up, speak well at the interview, and pretty much he would be working under me for a little bit. What does he do the night before the interview? He goes to a concert and gets completely trashed, shows up to the interview reeking of alcohol and lettuce. Obviously, my boss wasn't going to deal with this, so he told my friend he wasn't going to hire him. My friend gets confrontational with my boss, and we had to call the cops. He runs downstairs to get back into his car, and that's when the cops arrive. Not only did he have open alcohol in the car, and enough substances to put down a bull elephant. I haven't seen the kid in years, and I don't know when I will again. Story 12. In high school, he was left with a $1.5 million inheritance from his grandmother. He had already secured a scholarship to some prestigious school across the country. All that went down the drain. He stopped going to school, lost his scholarship, bought a house, and partied away most of the rest of the money. Within 6 months, he was broke. After another 6 months, he had lost the cars, the toys, and the house. My buddy actually bought a jet ski off him for really cheap because he needed money. Last I heard, he was working construction and living in a hotel. Don't trust a 17-year-old kid with $1.5 million. There is nothing wrong with trying to provide for your kids or grandkids and make sure they have a safe future. But this grandma should have known this kid better to entrust him with that money. It should have been a trust fund at least. Grandma should have taken some time and sat down with him at some point before she knew she was going to pass and give him some financial advice. Anything. But honestly, if I was that kid in that situation, I might have behaved the same way. Story 13. Cousin of mine had never smoked lettuce before, so he decided to try it for his birthday. Not knowing anything about it, he went out and bought synthetic lettuce and smoked it by himself. He freaked out and thought he was dying, so he tried to call an ambulance. I'm not sure what happened, but instead of an ambulance, a cop showed up and my cousin got scared and hid. The officer eventually found him, and my cousin proceeded to punch the officer and was promptly tackled to the ground and arrested. The cop fractured his hand tackling my cousin, so they added that to the charges of assaulting a police officer. Story 14. Got pregnant by a guy who was unable to support them, or himself right out of high school. Had the baby. Didn't go to college like I planned. Married loser guy. Had a bunch more kids. They live in the trailer park next to her mom. Both work minimum wage retail jobs and struggle to survive. She had a lot of plans to break that cycle. She was the product of it herself. One unexpected pregnancy later, and she's stuck in it and hoping her kids will do better. It's sad to watch. Story 15. Drunk Mike used to be just regular Mike. Drank almost every day from the time he was 15 to whenever. After I got married and bought a house, I told him I didn't want him him to know where I lived. He would show up at random times with random people to people's houses, and trouble always followed. And I wished the best for him. Saw him at a funeral a few years back. Couple years sober, but he literally drank himself stupid. Saying he's a bit slow now is a gross understatement. To be honest, when the guy said saw him at a funeral later, I thought it would meant that this guy was going to be in the casket. Was the guy still a drunk when they talked at the funeral? Did he quit, but is the brain damage permanent? That's a bit scary. How often does that kind of situation happen to drunks? Story 16. I have a friend who had gotten 2 bachelor's degrees, economics and political science, and wanted to get into politics. He hung around with the same friends from high school, some of which were not very good people. While hanging out with one of them, he got drunk and ruined his future. He was arrested for DUI, resisting arrest, and assaulting a police officer. He hasn't found full-time employment since. Story 17. My friend and I both got hired by a high-powered firm at the same time. He let the power go to his head and would never bus his own table at the company cafeteria. Why should I clean up after myself? That's what we pay the janitors for. Our manager fired him for being an arrogant douche. Story 18. Got into substances, got into some debt. Was told one day, hey, if you go to this guy's house with us and help us collect on a debt, we'll forgive you. They robbed the guy. Even though he just was there to look intimidating, he was picked up on felony accessory to armed robbery and served 8 years on a plea deal. Was originally looking at 20. Ruined his future at only 20 years old. Desperate times call for desperate measures, but out of the frying pan and into the fire. So young. I really hope this person finds his way out of this situation and pulls himself back up to find something that can really sustain him for his life. Hopefully he can look back on this situation later in life and call it, I made a few mistakes when I was dumb and young. Story 19. Very intelligent but very lazy stoner friend of mine. He dropped out of school to basically smoke pot and play video games all day. Lived with his mother in a small apartment where they constantly fought. Miraculously, he got a great secure job for life with the post office, postal service, but quit after about 2 weeks because he and the boss did not see eye to eye, or some stupid reason like that. That was about 10 years ago. Hasn't had a job since and has been living off the inheritance his dad left him 2 years ago. But that money is drying up. Story 20. A friend washed out and was cut from the Cincinnati Reds baseball organization, and he was simply crushed. All his dreams crashed. No one could console him, and he started drinking. His fairly well-off parents died a short time later. He was an only child and ended up inheriting a very sizable amount of money. 6 months later, he was found in his apartment. He had drunk himself to death. The 2 huge tragedies in his life: being drafted to play professional baseball and inheriting a ton of money. When I think about him, I both cry about him and I get furious at him. It was all just a mess. Story 21. One guy I knew had the great idea to drink alcohol and then drive extremely speedy. It ended up when his car wrapped itself nicely around a tree. Guy was 19, had massive brain damage afterwards, and has lived in a disabled home since then, unable to form proper sentences, walk, or do anything actually. Please leave your story in the comments. I would love to make a video on them in the future. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe.